Hello, gasaholics. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you've got gas. It's, well, another edition for you. Hey, today we're going to talk about a little thing I love, and that's Corvettes and sports cars. Now, yesterday's show, we talked about the misconception of what a sports car was and how some magazines are calling Mustangs and Camaros sports cars. Well, there is only one true American sports car currently in production. Now, there have been others along the way, but only one has stood the test of time, and that is the Corvette. That's right, the Chevrolet Corvette. That's the car that stood the test of time. The original Corvette was introduced in New York at the Waldorf Astoria New York Auto Show in 1953. There were three body types at that time proposed. There was the fastback. It was called the Corvair, and we all know how that had turned out. There was another one called the Nomad, and that one became a Bel Air model in 1955, but never was produced by Chevrolet on a Corvette chassis, other than the show vehicle. The third was a Roadster. Now, this was more in line with what sports cars were in the early 1950s. It didn't have windows. It had side curtains. It didn't have door handles. You couldn't lock the car, but with side curtains, what difference did it make? It had an inline six-cylinder engine. Now, people may shun that, and a lot of people did back in the day, but Chevrolet didn't have a V8 engine yet. And they looked at other sports cars. And most of the ones that were selling in, well, not droves, because they weren't all that popular back then, but the ones that were popular were four-cylinder and six-cylinder inlines. Now, of course, Jaguar had their dual overhead cam engine in the XK120. MGs had four-cylinder, Triumphs had four cylinders, Singers, four cylinders, and a passel of other sports cars that came in, or Persuado sports cars that came into the country, all had four cylinders. Porsche, well, that didn't come in until a lot later, but they had a flat air-cooled four-cylinder. They were basically a Volkswagen chassis car with a nice-looking body. So the Corvette with a six-cylinder really wasn't all that bad. The bad part was they coupled it to a Powerglide automatic transmission, and no sports car at that point in time even thought about putting an automatic transmission in a car. Heck, that was sacrilege. Automatic transmission in a sports car? Oh, no way. Well, Chevrolet did it. And it was to their detriment as well. First-year sales of the Corvette were dismal at best. Now, part of that could have been the color options. There were none. White with a red interior. That was your only choice. Well, okay. It had some nice features. It had the wire covers over the headlights to keep rocks from breaking those headlight beams. Cool, right? Stylish and functional. It had nice taillights in the back. They stood up high. They were rounded. You could see them. It was effective. The license plate was in a cove in the trunk. Spare tire was in the trunk as well. The body was revolutionary. It was fiberglass. It was lightweight. Now, initially, they started production in Michigan, and each body was handmade. Multiple pieces of fiberglass mat put into a mold and then laid up by hand, and the resin was put in there by hand with rollers and brushes and all the things that, well, hobbyists like myself would do. But that's how they produced it. The Corvette chassis was, well, it was a kind of a modified sedan chassis. And it used the sedan front suspension. It used parallel leaf springs, which wasn't a bad idea, with a solid rear axle, which was actually quite contemporary. No one else had really an independent suspension at that point in time, although Mercedes was just about there, and the 300 SL definitely had that, and 300 SL was even a six-cylinder car as well. but it was overhead cam and it was mechanical fuel injection and put out a lot more horsepower than the Corvette, the Camaro, I'm getting them all mixed up, the Corvette would produce. Well, the Corvette did produce 150 plus horsepower, which was actually pretty reasonable for the time. Side draft carburetors fed the 6-cylinder engine, and it was, well, sprightly. It was held back by that automatic transmission. I mean, not even a 3-speed manual was available back then. But the Corvette persevered. And in 1955, under the tutelage of Zora Argus Duntov, they got the V8. Now, I've seen the V8 prototype car. It was owned, or it could still be owned by a gentleman down in the Palm Desert area. And he brought it out to a car show there, the Dr. George Show. That's a charity show in Palm Desert area, Palm Springs area, at the Indian Wells tennis courts. And it looks like it's somewhat cobbled together because, well, it was. The Chevrolet engineers put together this car to just see how a manual transmission would work. So they had to modify things and manufacture things and, well, prototype, fit things, like clutch linkage. It worked. 265 V8 engine was much more powerful and torquey than the 6-cylinder. The 3-speed transmission, the manual transmission, really gave it some oomph. And the Corvette became a popular sports car at this point in time because now it had the power to fit the image. The body style was still the same as the first Corvettes introduced, and that was fine. It wasn't until 1955 or 56 that they changed the body type, the style anyway. The suspension remained the same. The brakes remained the same. The body changed, and therein lied part of the problem. Now, even though the Corvette was fiberglass, it was heavy for its time, about 3,000 pounds. Now, sports cars of the day were in the 2,000-pound range, well, except for the Jaguar, but again, it had more horsepower. And the Mercedes, and it had more horsepower too. But the Corvette was the only full production sports car. Now, there were other sports cars made in the U.S. Many of them were kits or specialties or low production vehicles. Kaiser even had the Darren. It was a fiberglass sports car as well. 2-seater. Doors were kind of unique in that they slid into the fenders. They didn't open up conventional style. They had a flathead 6-cylinder engine, and they had a supercharger option as well, giving them some power. But it was a Kaiser, and it was built on basically the Henry J chassis from 1951. Didn't really handle well, and it didn't have the following. The Corvette, with its Chevrolet heritage, did have some following. And by 1955, it had a bigger following because now it was a powerful sports car. Now, Ford came out with the Thunderbird in 1955 as well, but it had its issues. First off, Ford never claimed it to be a sports car. It didn't handle quite well. It was heavy as well, but it had the things that the Corvette possibly could have and should have had. It had roll-up windows. It had a factory hardtop. It had door handles and doors you could lock. It had a multitude of colors. It had its floor shift just like the Corvette did, but they had an automatic transmission and a 3-speed transmission. Later on, they got a supercharger as well. But the Corvette still remained the only American-built sports car that was in full production and continued on. Now, the Corvette, as I said, went into production or introduced in 1953, but it missed 1 year of production since introduction, and that was 1983. There were no production retail sale Corvettes in 1983, or 83 model. Now, the 1984 Corvette did come out in late 1983, but it was a 1984 model. Now, there's one or two of the 1983s still around. One I saw on display at the Corvette Museum this last year. The biggest difference between an 83 and an 84 were the wheels, is all I can tell. They still had the crossfire injection system at that point in time, which came up from the C3s. It was 210, I think it was, horsepower, which was abysmal by today's standards. But again, the advancements hadn't been there, and for the time, that was a lot of horsepower. As a matter of fact, the car in 1984 was so popular and successful in racing with that engine that the SCCA had to create a new class just for the Corvette. They called it the Corvette Challenge Series because the Corvette was quicker than anything else in its class. And there was a lot of protests about it. It was a race car from the factory. I've had two C4 models, a 1985 and a 1989. They're fun. I loved it. Now, the 85 had the automatic transmission, the 700R, which was okay. The only reason I got that was the Doug Nash 4-speed that they put in there, which is a 4+2, really had a bad reputation at the time, and it was kind of complicated. I waited for my second Corvette to get an 89 when the Getrag 5-speed came out. Or was it a 6-speed? I don't remember. The car's been gone for about a year now, and my memory's not that good. Or at least not on some things. But the manual transmission version of my 1989, that was a fun car to drive. It was modified. It also had a lot of options. It had every option you could have, short of the Corvette Challenge option. But it had the brakes, it had the quicker steering, it had the oil coolers, it had all the pieces and parts that went into the Corvette Challenge car, except the hand-built engine, the roll cage, and the special wheels. And it was a fun car to drive. I've had two C5s. Got one now, and it's fun. I like that car. We've got the car, we've got an anniversary edition, so it's a special color combination, and, it's cool. But one of the things I've noticed about the Corvette is throughout its production, they tried to improve it. In racing, the Corvette was a pretty good car. Not a great car, but a pretty good car. Because, well, it had some things that were lacking that, well, the corporate people kind of delayed and stopped and, well, they just didn't understand. And Duntov tried to explain it, but it took a long time for him to get through to the upper management on it. The brakes were a weak point, a very significant weak point because of the heavy car this was. The Corvettes were 3,000 pounds, and they had drum brakes. Now, drum brakes are fine on the street, and many cars had drum brakes in the 50s and even 60s and 70s. But if you're going to go racing and you're driving a high-performance car, you need better braking than that. Well, Duntov finally persevered. And by 1966 or 65, they got front-wheel disc brakes. Then by 66, 67, they had four-wheel disc brakes, and the braking issue was now addressed. And the Corvettes could stop and could go through a race without wearing out their brakes significantly. Yeah, they still wore them, and they got pretty thin by the end of a race, but they had the braking they needed to compete. The drum brakes were gone. I mean, Chevrolet came up with a high-performance kit. It was a race kit. It was an RPO called the 684. It was a heavy-duty racing package. And that came with thinned aluminum or thinned brake drums, metal brake shoes, semi-metallics they called them. It had a better suspension. It had stiffer shocks, stiffer springs. And it was, for all intent and purposes, a factory race car. Now, in 1957, Chevrolet and the U.S. manufacturers pulled out of officially supporting racing. Duntov was able to do some backdoor deals, and the Corvette still remained in competition. And to help them, there were a number of factory race parts available. Hi, Randy, how you doing? Now, that included, and some people may not think about this, the side pipes on Corvettes. You realize that was a factory option, a header, but you've got to look at the flange to see that the part number is there, because that was done specifically for the Corvette to get them into racing. The cast iron headers that you find, or exhaust manifolds you find on most Corvettes, that was the standard. They didn't put the headers on the Corvette You could buy them from the dealer, and they were a factory part, so they were allowed in racing on a stock vehicle. They had an insert muffler on the side, and they worked with different length headers and so forth, and they worked pretty good. Now, during this period of modifications that were kind of backdoored, they went from the 265 to the 283. They got fuel injection. Then they went to a 327 in 1962. And then the big blocks came in 1965. Now, Chevrolet introduced the 396, the porcupine head because of the angle of the valves. The 396 only lasted 1 year. They bored it out and became a 427. Now, Chevrolet knew the limitations of their engineering and budgetary problems they had. So what they did is to get the horsepower and get the modifications they needed, rather than pay their engineers the development money to get these things going, they sourced out to leading hot rodding people and drag racing and racing people. They went to people like our friends, Valley Head Service, to do the head work. And they took other companies. Let's take a look. The Valley Head Service, Mondello Racing, Airflow Research, Butch Elkins, Smokey Eunuch. Now, these people were given the cylinder heads, told, do your best job. Let's see what you can come up with. Chevrolet took those heads back after these guys did their massaging to see which one performed the best for what they were trying to accomplish. Now, I don't know whose they chose, but they chose the one that worked the best. And that became the factory prototype and how they built the later heads to go on these engines. And that's how they got into backdoor racing. Here was a factory race part, ported, set up by a leading cylinder head manufacturer that they didn't tell you who it was, but it was a factory cylinder head, factory part, homologated into racing, no problem. Same thing with the headers. They did the same thing with the blocks. And they even made special aluminum blocks back in those days that were, well, not quite the production block that you wanted for your car, but they helped support the Chaparral racing team as well as the Corvette racing team with these engines. And these are some of the engines that, they gave Cobra some good runs. It was the ZL1, the LT2, all aluminum 454s, the closed chamber L88s, the open chamber L88s, and more. They had two dynamometer cells where they used dedicated efforts to support these production engines to get things going. There was an L88 Super Duty engine assembly in 1966, while the RPO regular production option L88 wasn't released until 1967. These are some of the things that happened. Now, that way kind of makes sense. I mean, you've got to have some development time before you can release it. Now, big block Corvette headers I told you about had a part number stamped into the flange. And if you've got this part number in the flange, 3960710, you got the factory headers on that car. And those are non-modified vehicles. So now you look at it, in some states, a modified exhaust system can get you a ticket. With that part number, that is the factory part. It's not a modified exhaust. Now, same thing happened with springs. What they found is on some of the bigger tracks and the higher speeds, the car was actually bottoming out. It was taking the suspension down to the metal. You know, the upper control arm was up as high as it would go. The lower control arm was banging against the frame or the stops at the time. So to combat that, they had to come up with a special race suspension. Now, this suspension was not at all compatible with street driving. Now, they had the F41 and the F51 suspensions later on. Those were performance suspensions, but they're Gymkhana suspensions, as they kind of call them, but they weren't the race suspensions. Now, the race suspension for the C1 and C2 Corvettes, well, they were special made. The RPO 41 coils, for example, were smaller, and that was the biggest spring you could get for street use back in those days, F41s. The they didn't give it an F number, but it was a factory race set, and the suspension was so heavy and so stiff, you could knock your teeth out driving it on the street. There were super rear springs. They had to stiffen the back end up as well, especially on the transverse leafs that came on the 63 and later independent suspension Corvettes. The coil springs in the front were significantly heavier. I'm looking for the data on that right now because it was significant. Now, some of the other people that did development for Chevrolet and the Corvette were people like our Moon Equipment guys here in Santa Fe Springs, California Speed, Hollywood Auto, Gratiot Auto Supply. Now, these people also sold those factory parts. Yeah, you can get Chevrolet genuine factory parts right from there. All right, so the new set of springs I was talking about, F41 was considered the epitome of street springs. That was the highest performance spring. Well, here's the difference. The F41 coil springs had the leaf spring, a 305 pound per inch strength. The race spring, 550 pounds. That was to keep the car from leaning and bottoming out the suspension. And it was stiff. You couldn't drive it on the street. Now, what they also noticed was those skinny wheels. That didn't work. Tire sizes were getting bigger. Wheels were getting bigger. You could only go negative camber or negative offset so far. And then it would hit the body, and you could not modify the body. So that's when the positive offset or the deep dish tire wheels came out. Chevrolet had their own. Now, a lot of guys were going to aftermarket wheels because aluminum wheels were lighter. They were stiffer. They didn't bend like aluminum wheels did. You kept the tire planted. Bigger tires, you needed those wider wheels. Well, you couldn't have a tire that stuck out past the fender. Chevrolet came up with factory-authorized flared fenders for the C3 Corvettes. Yeah, factory-authorized. They had a factory part number. Now, at one point, they decided they weren't going to install those at the factory. They planned on it, but the cost and the complication of putting it in, well, let's stop that. So you could buy the flares over the counter with a GM part number on it, which made them legal for SCCA sports car racing back in the day. They're cool looking. They're good looking. I've seen a number of them on C3s, and I like them. But they had the part number on a tag, fiberglassed onto the inside of that fender flare. Now, that was just a kind of a bubble flare, or a little flare on the C3 Corvettes. I remember the Greenwood Corvettes with these huge sculptured flares on the back and the front to make sure you got plenty of tire sticking out. And it kept it covered. I always thought those were an aftermarket piece that Greenwood had come up with. Nope, those were designed in-house by Chevrolet. And again, they had a factory part number. And for the Trans Am series and the other series that the Corvettes ran in back in the day, and the Greenwood, the BF Goodrich, for example, tire car that was running had huge tires on it. And the flares were big box type flares that were very, well, sculptured to the body. Those were factory. They designed them in-house. Corvette, ever expanding. How about the glass covers on the C3 instead of the pop-up headlights? They did that too. Better aerodynamics and less complication, less weight, because you didn't have to have the vacuum mechanisms in there to open and close the lights. Again, a factory piece that was developed by General Motors. So, modifying a Corvette has been something that's been around since the Corvette was first introduced. There's an organization, the National Corvette Restorers Society, and I'm a member of that, that frowns on modifications. And my last C4 was a very modified vehicle. And, well, they gave me a second flight when I went in for judging because of those modifications. And I had the Greenwood body kit on my C4. Well, these are factory parts. Should they be considered Corvette parts? Well, yeah, they were. They were designed by General Motors. They weren't assembly line parts. You had to put them on yourself. But they had factory part numbers. Corvette Restorer Society. It's a great way to keep the heritage of the Corvette going. The Corvette is still the only American sports car that's been in full production. And I'm sorry, I got a soft spot in my head for Corvettes. I like them. I hope you do too. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got gas. Have a great evening or a great day. Take a look at a Corvette sometime. Drive one. You might like it. I know I do. All right, GAAS-Great American Auto Scene brought to you by Irwindale Drag Strip, Irwindale Speedway, Valley Head Service, and Service Tech Equipment. For all the equipment you need for the shop you've got. Service Tech Equipment. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You have a great day. Thanks for being a gasaholic. Take care now.